Well, thanks so much, Lara, for the kind invitation to come and share some of our work. I'm excited to kind of hear some of people's perspective, and I know you guys have a lot of experience with different underground aspects that become very relevant to some of the stuff we're doing. So what I want to share today, some of the work we've been doing at Colorado State over the past, I'd say, 8 years or so on wildfire. Things have picked up quite a bit towards the end of 2022. And we're continuing the work to kind of see what we can do in that space. So I'll be presenting a new model that we developed for predicting damage to the built environment in a wildfire event. And I'll just provide very brief motivations kind of to start the conversation. But I want to show you the vulnerability framework at a very, very high level and kind of show you what we can do with the analysis in terms of estimating the fire perimeter, estimating damage. And I'll just kind of highlight some issues related to future work that we've been thinking about. There's a lot more, of course, that what I'm showing in one slide, but just to kind of get the conversation going. So one of the most important things, of course, is that the existing wildfire risk reduction philosophy is centered around fire-adapted communities, resilient landscape, and safe and effective response. And if you look at all these three different sort of circles, and this comes from a website, it's called Wildfire Risk, you'll find that all three are connected. You cannot determine if your landscape is resilient if you're not able to predict wildfire risk in that area and determine if you have different occupancy categories for your buildings, are the buildings going to survive or not? And if you want to have effective response, you cannot also have an effective response unless you know what the damage would look like once an event happens. And to make sure you have communities that can adapt, you want to minimize losses as much as possible. Recovery is very important. And of course, wildfire recovery has been critical. Insurance plays a significant role. But in order for us to kind of make the process a lot easier on people, we want to make sure we minimize losses, damage and losses as much as possible. So they're all three connected. And in my personal opinion, the fundamental prerequisite to tackle these different complex issues is in estimating damage. Of course, there's a lot more to them than just estimating damage, but that's the fundamental prerequisite in order for you to dig deeper into any of these three entities. So when we started to look into kind of wildfires in general, of course, there has been a major issue with increasing frequency and intensity of the events. And we've seen in the literature that usually there are wildfire mitigation strategies that are more or less fits the idea of one-size-fits-all solution. There are certain mitigation strategies, and they're recommended for all communities, regardless of what the community looks like or what the characteristics of the community is. So we wanted to get into that space of understanding how fire behaves in the wildland-urban interface. And we need to develop a model or a tool that can allow us to understand this behavior. One of the important things in developing this tool is to have something that can be used to model different communities, as opposed to say, here's a tool, we came up with a solution, that solution gets applied everywhere. So it's very community specific. And that tool has to be computationally friendly and we should have the ability to run it pretty rapidly, because one of the most important things about this analysis is to include uncertainties in your estimate of damage. And if you don't have a tool that can run fast, then you won't be able to do that. And the ability to include uncertainties ties to the ability of communicating risk, because risk by its nature implies probabilistic analysis, which means you have to have a very fast tool that you can run. So we wanted to look into that space. And so we started to look at vulnerability frameworks. And when we started to entertain the idea of how do we estimate damage, of course, the most straightforward way of looking at community vegetation built environment interaction and modeling of that in a wildfire event is to use something called computational fluid dynamic. It's basically a physics-based approach that models the entire process it's not difficult to build a model and run the model at all. It just takes forever. And because it takes forever, from a computational perspective, people have explored that area, but they're only able to run, for example, 2 homes and a tree, which doesn't give you anything about the whole community. So these CFD models are not that attractive because of the computational demand. So we started to look at how these wildfire propagation in communities kind of looks similar to how disease transmits in a social network. There is some sort of similarity here. Some homes transmit fires more than the others, some vegetation transmit more than the others, some receive more than the other. And of course, mitigation and fuel reduction somewhere in the community will have an impact on vulnerability, whether the vulnerability is actually for another tree or a home at different location in the community. So the idea here is that the entire wildfire sort of risk management should be viewed for communities as a sort of network problem. It's not, we should not be viewing things the way we are right now in general. We say, you know, as long as I protect my home, I should be okay. As long as I apply mitigations to my home, I'm okay. Because you could apply mitigation to your homes and it could be a very large waste of funds because you didn't even put a dent on the risk for your home. So how to orchestrate mitigations in the community in terms of hardening homes and reducing fuel at a specific location is very important concept, and you cannot do that without looking at the problem as a network problem. So using this kind of network concept, we developed something called directed graph, and this graph, it's like a graph, has nodes and links. These nodes represent homes and vegetation, and the links essentially describes the interaction, the heat transfer interaction between them. Once you're able to understand how these nodes of vegetation and homes are connected, and you're able to kind of understand the behavior, then you can work the problem backwards and you say, what kind of building mitigation properties or vegetation properties that I can modify? It could be hardening, it could be removing fuel, and so on, to lower risk to the whole community, not just to that specific node, right? So the idea here is that we take a community with homes and buildings and vegetation represented with these nodes that represent the vegetation and the buildings, and link them with links that can take that, what we call, these links have the probability of fire transmitting from one of these nodes to the other node. And that's what we call PTR that you see on the left-hand side of the figure. And this PTR values take into account convection, radiation, and ember spotting from other homes and neighboring homes and so on. So again, we're treating the problem as a network problem. Without providing too much detail because of the time constraint, I'll just mention that, of course, we take into consideration the properties of the buildings and roof property and siding and so on. And we also take into consideration the fuel in terms of vegetation. So we have what we call wildland vegetation and urban vegetation. Both have to be considered and incorporated. And the way we do this for the wildland vegetation, we're entertaining different ways now, but I'll tell you how we've done it so far. For the wildland vegetation, we essentially have nodes that are centered in these cells, and we can refine the cells as much as possible. In this case, we're looking at fuel that is 30 meter by 30 meter cells, and then you put a node right in the center representing the vegetation in that area. And depending on how much vegetation, that's how many nodes you would have. And this vegetation have a lot of properties that include moisture content, flame type, fuel volume, and many other things that become very critical for that heat transfer analysis that we're doing with the convection, radiation, and ember. So a lot of the properties that are embedded in these raster files become critical for our analysis. We also look into urban vegetation, and urban vegetation is defined really as the vegetation that you find within the built environment. There are no good files that have this type of vegetations yet, or no good data so far. But the way we include the impact of this urban vegetation is that we actually go to the for each structural node, we look at the amount of vegetation. We can do that with satellite images, and then we provide a sort of a vegetation score that alters the ignition potential, this PTR values that I showed. So we play with the PTR to include vegetation versus no vegetation. We are working right now. We already did that, developed also another process to include fuel in the defensible space, also through that normalize the score approach. And we're doing other processes where we're actually modeling every single fuel also as a separate node as well to see the difference. So what we can do, I mean, so this is just a very high level overview, again, because of the time. But what we can do with this model is two things. First, we can determine the fire boundary. And then the second thing is try to estimate the damage. The fire boundary, we use something called most probable path to kind of give us an indication of how likely the fire is going to propagate from one node to the other node, and what would the fire boundary ultimately look like. So that analysis looks something like this. So imagine you have wild land, this colors at the boundaries of the sparks represent fire with different intensity coming into your communities. And then you have different nodes in the community represent ignitable nodes. The red ones are the nodes very close to the wild land, and the other nodes are other ignitable objects that are in the way of this centered node, which let's say we're interested in at this point. What we want to know is that first we want to identify all these ignitable objects that you can see. Then we want to develop the graph between all these nodes, and then determine the likelihood of the fire going from one of these boundary nodes, let's say that was the ignition node, to my blue node. And we do that actually for not just the blue node, we do that for all nodes. So we identify the most probable path for that fire to go from the red node to the blue node. And of course, we do that across all nodes to determine the likelihood of the fire going to that middle node through ignition of all these boundary nodes. And we do that for all nodes in the community, not just the middle blue one. And we do that to be able to determine the boundary of the fire overall. The other thing that we do with this model, so this is one thing to determine the fire boundary. The other thing is that we reflect on the damage and how the damage looks like in the community. So we entertain a concept called relative vulnerability. Instead of looking at absolute damage, we look at how the vulnerability looks like relative to each other, from one home to the other. So what does the damage vulnerability look like from one to the other node? And that's what we call relative vulnerability. The other thing that we also do, and that's now one way of us evaluating the results of the model, beyond the fire boundary with the most probable path or the relative vulnerability for the damage, we look at two other things. First, we want to see if my model gives me relative vulnerability values at different pens or different ranges, how many buildings fall within each of that range in the model, and what does that distribution look like? We also evaluate the survival ratio. So if my model tells me that the vulnerability is very low, in reality, that node or that house should survive. If it doesn't survive, in reality, something is off. So in general, the higher the vulnerability from the model, the lower the survival ratio should be in reality, right? If you compare the model to what happened in reality, you'll see a drop in survivability. So a monotonically decreasing curve, survival curve, which essentially compares our results to what happened in reality, is an indication that the model is doing something right, right? The fact that it's at low vulnerability, you have high survival, and at high vulnerability, you have low survival, that's the way it should be. So I'm going to share some of the results that we've had so far with the model to kind of show you what we're able to produce out of that. And again, I barely touched the model itself because of the time, but happy to reflect on the details of the model if needed. So the fire parameter, this just show you two examples. So we have what you see on the left-hand side here at the top of the slide is the Marshall fire. So the left-hand side is the actual fire boundary, and the right-hand side is what the model produces. You can see a value of 1 in that contour line that varies from roughly 0.2 all the way to the yellow value of 1. When you reach a value of 1, that means the fire dies. So the fire boundary produced with the model on the right-hand side for the Marshall fire matches very well with the fire boundary that happened in reality. And in the lower picture, you see the Lahaina fire. And again, the boundary of the Lahaina fire matches really well with the boundary that we produced from the model. So the model is able to tell us, here is the area that you should be considering for your fire, given that the ignition is located at the following point. And what we do is once we determine the boundary, let's say it's a new area that I've never, that, hopefully no fire happened before. I can put an ignition point, get the boundary of the fire. Once I have the boundary, and then I can go back to this area and determine the relative vulnerability of the homes relative to each other and determine the likelihood of damage of homes in the community. So for that piece, for example, for the damage assessment, I'll show you some of the results. This is the campfire. The model produced 85% match in terms of damage. We were so excited. By the way, there are no other models anywhere in the world that we're aware of that can capture damage. So I'm sure we have a lot more to do, but it's exciting that we're at that point. So you can see on the left-hand side, so the observed damage. The blue represents no damage, and the red represents destroyed buildings or completely burned. And the far left-hand side is what happened in reality. The very far right is what the model produced in terms of the relative vulnerability results. The relative vulnerability is not a 0-1 kind of measure. It varies from whatever that number all the way to 1. But we can take a threshold value, cut it off, and then determine a 0-1 value for the damage. So if I take a threshold for damage versus no damage, it happened to be 0.72, and then I produce that picture in the middle, which looks very similar to the one on the far left. So what's in the middle is what we produced with the model in terms of damage versus no damage. What you see on the bottom, the survival ratio curve is monotonically decreasing, implying that the model is capturing properly areas of low vulnerability and areas of high vulnerability, which is fantastic. We did this for the Marshall Fire. I figured I'll show more on the Marshall Fire today since, we're all from Colorado here, so it's more important for us. So you can see, again, the top right picture is what we calculated in terms of the relative vulnerability. The very left is the observed damage, what happened in reality. And the middle one, if I take my relative vulnerability and cut it off and turn it into no damage versus damage, this is what we get, which again looks very similar to what happened in reality. The survival curve, again, is monotonically decreasing, implying that the model is able to capture areas of low vulnerability and high vulnerability very well. That's what we would want to see. And, the nice thing about, of course, again, the Marshall Fire, the interesting thing about, wildfire damage in general is that it's not intuitive. You cannot look, cannot put an ignition point and intuitively say, this is the area that will burn versus not. But the model is able to capture that, and you can see the similarities are somewhat striking. Now, of course, it's not perfect, but it's very close at 72%. And if you actually look at zoom-in areas for the Marshall Fire, which is what you see in the slide, the bottom two rows show that the observed damage, the zoomed-in areas that have the observed damage and the calculated damage. And you can see the similarities between the observed and the calculated is actually very good. It's off in certain cases, few nodes here and there, but that's the best we can do. And there are data that we don't have at all. For example, if somebody had a fence, I didn't have that data. If firefighters were standing somewhere putting fire down in a house, I didn't have that data. So we don't expect a perfect match, of course. And actually, interestingly, if I can show you this, even if you look at the relative vulnerability, so I'm going to zoom in here to show you this, but you can see the model. These circles here, you see so you have this blue squares. The blue squares on structures that are relatively green/blue, right? You can see this is blue, this is green. These are survived. This one is green survived. The ones that have red colors and orange colors, which is the vulnerability produced by the model we developed, in reality burned. So this one, the model says high vulnerability, high vulnerability, high vulnerability. Then they actually burned. The ones that are low vulnerability did not burn. Similarly, what you can see here in the top right picture, high vulnerability burned, low vulnerability, because it's light green, it didn't burn. So even when you look at it, and the white background, I apologize, but it snowed right after the Marshall Fire. That's why it's white background. We did this for the Lahaina wildfire, and for the Lahaina wildfire, we did something actually interesting. We did not have the wind field. We ran some analysis last night. I'll tell you about it shortly. but we did not have the wind field. And so what we wanted to do is to say, okay, well, if I don't have the wind field, can I back calculate the wind field so that the damage that is produced by the model is as close as possible to what happened in reality? And what you see in the middle picture here is the real damage. Again, blue survived and red is destroyed buildings. And what you see on the right is the calculated vulnerability from my model based on the wind field that you see on the far left. So the wind field on the far left was almost like optimized to produce the right-hand side damage level. Now, the damage level, again, is listed in relative vulnerability, but it matches really, really well with what was observed. And when you look at the wind field, which we back calculated the wind field in this case, we found that the wind field looks very, very similar to what has been reported in the news media, where people indicated that it was east going west and south going northwest. So it is doing the right thing. We recently actually obtained some wind data, not at this fine resolution, from someone for the Lahaina, and we got very good results also. This analysis gave us 74% accuracy, and the wind that we used, using actual wind analysis that someone did, gave us 67% accuracy. If you zoom in on some of these areas here, you can see a very, very good correlation between what we're predicting versus what happened in reality. Blue areas means survived, and usually blue areas in the model have very low vulnerability values. Blue areas in reality have low vulnerability values in the model. So the model is, again, doing the right thing in terms of capturing areas of high vulnerability and low vulnerability and so on. We're of course not done. I mean, we're doing many other things to continue to improve the model and continue to kind of test the capabilities. And so one of these things that, for example, we're doing is understanding how mitigations at different locations would impact the entire risk for the whole community. So we're working on this now because, as I mentioned, vegetations and structures behave as a network. So understanding how many homes or how many vegetations I need to remove or harden, and what would that do to the whole community is a very is an intriguing question we're trying to answer. As I mentioned earlier, predicting damage in a wildfire event is really key to establish mitigations that are effective and as cheap as possible. If you have a lot of money and you say, I'm going to divide this money on the whole community and I'll give every home $100, $200 to do something, this could be not effective at all. Instead, we use this model to work it backwards and say, here are the homes that need to be hardened, and here's the hardening mechanisms coupled with fuel reduction to get the most return on your investment. The other thing I didn't show today, but we're doing some analysis on risk where we're trying to look at not just the damage potential, but how does that damage potential kind of, when overlaid on ignition potential, what does that mean in terms of risk? Because if the damage potential is high, but you will never ignite, why should worry? And the other way around is also true. But of course, there is a variation between ignition probability and damage, and overlaying them on top of each other is very important to understand the risk. And we can do that for every day of the month and every month of the year as needed, because you can develop ignition potential for every day and for every month, and you can develop vulnerability for every day and every month based on the wind and other things. We can use the model to develop the best strategies, as I mentioned, and we can also use it to develop optimal firefighting strategies. We're currently extending the model capabilities to look at fire propagation over time, and just to give you a snapshot of that, you can see here in this slide is steamboat and the campfire on the right-hand side. And we just want to, I mean, nothing happens steamboat, but we just wanted to look at fire propagation when you have very limited vegetation versus a lot of vegetation. So the left-hand side, there's no real case, which is good. But the right-hand side is the campfire, and we're getting very, very good results in comparison to what happened in reality in terms of the fire propagation over time. And matches very well with what happened in reality. But we're not done with this work. And yeah, that's it. I tried to stick to. Has any questions or thoughts?
Cool. Yeah, if there's any questions, feel free to come off mute. I didn't see anything dropped in the chat.
Yeah, I have a question. Whoops, sorry, this is Cindy. Who is applying this in areas around Colorado? How is this model being used right now?
Okay, so areas around Colorado, we have a couple of people on the call today that are super interested. So we're talking to the city of Boulder. And we're talking, we did some work for a county called Ouray through the Western Fire Chief something. I forgot the last.
West Region Wildfire Council in the
yes,
town
thank
of Ouray.
you. Yep. Yeah. So we did that for them. We're talking to Colorado Springs, and we're talking also to I mean seriously. I mean, we're moving forward with contracts and things like that. But yeah, which just started, so it's not like we've been doing this for a while. So that's that. But we did some work for a very, very large community in Southern California. It's called Rancho Mission Viejo. And we also are working with Marin County in San Francisco. We're doing work for them. So we're getting busy. But it's been great exploring these collaborations.
I was just going to jump in. So Aaron Johnson, West Region Wildfire Council, and we're very excited about the results that you provided for the town of Ouray. I am curious on the relative vulnerability scale. You said that I think you mentioned like in one of your calculations you used a 0.72 cutoff. So are you seeing a pretty consistent relative value that you can use as a cutoff point throughout communities, or is that kind of going to vary fire by fire? And how would you use that going forward for fires that haven't occurred?
Yeah, excellent question. So far with 3 communities, because we did the test bed on the Marshall Fire, the Camp Fire, and the Glass Fire. So these already happened, and the Lahaina. And we found that 0.72, 0.73 is the cutoff for damage versus no damage. This could change in the future. That said, I always go back and I say, do I really want to turn the relative vulnerability into damage versus no damage? Maybe that's not the best way. I mean, we're just doing that for the sake of validating against what happened in reality, but leaving the vulnerability as a probabilistic number and perhaps turning them into low vulnerability, medium vulnerability, and high vulnerability, like there's different ranges that represent, maybe is a better way to communicate it with communities. And then, of course, maybe the low ones, you would be not worry about them too much, but then the high and the medium, you would have to worry. But again, where to apply the mitigation isn't necessarily focused on the ones that are only high and so on. It's actually, as I mentioned, it's like a network problem that one have to figure out exactly where to apply mitigations and reduce fuel to be more effective. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.